This morning we're in an LT-L83 5.3 with an 8-speed. Great combination. You guys know I like it a lot. It is a General Motors powertrain. And when I say General Motors, I mean the engine, transmission, wiring harness, engine controller, transmission controller. It's all GM. We've done a couple of these L83s recently, so I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the market. I've been doing engine conversions for going on 40 years right now. Back in the early 80s, I started doing V8 swaps and V6 swaps in Toyotas, and then of course Land Cruisers and Vegas and Pintos and you name it. I've been doing a lot of engine conversions, and a lot of same manufacturer engine conversions, like Ford Broncos. We take out the Midlands, put in Clevelands or whatever. In the Chevys, you take out a small block, you put in a big block. So an engine conversion always isn't cross-manufacturer. A lot of guys are probably going to be surprised to know that Jeep has kind of been a company that's been kicked around. Back when it was purchased by AMC, of course, it ended up getting some AMC engines, and the AMC Straight 6 was a great engine. We all know that the 4-liter was pretty awesome for what it was intended for, but it just didn't have the power to pull these Jeeps, nor did it have it didn't run clean enough for modern emissions. So your JK has a lot in common with a Gremlin or a Pacer, in that when AMC owned Jeep, AMC was kind of a company that would outsource a lot of their components. So yes, GM and Ford components found their way into Jeeps, including powertrains. Remember, Chrysler right now is much less American owned than General Motors. So we're getting European technology, and the Pentastar motor is a good indication of that, where the GM powertrain is still more American, as is the Hemi. And let me say, back in the day, and this would be about 2008, 2009, when we all started working on these JK engine conversions, you had basically the Hemi and the LS. We were doing the LS, and pretty much everybody else was doing the Hemi. The burden the Hemi had was the transmission. The original 545 was really a terrible transmission. It didn't matter how much power the Hemi put out. It was just a inefficient transmission that ran hot, didn't shift right. The Hemis were kind of slave to that, where the LSs had the 6-liter. So a lot of guys said, well, you got to go with the GM powertrain. In fact, you go to most mechanic shops, you go to most dealerships, and I deal with Chrysler dealerships all the time, and the overwhelming consensus is GM makes the best powertrains. They may not make the best cars, they may not make the best decisions, but ever since the 1950s, the small block and then eventually the big block, then the LSs, they've really become the staple of the aftermarket engine performance world. Now, I'm a big Mopar guy. I've got Hemis myself. In fact, I had a 68 Hemi Charger 500. I've got a Challenger TA. I've had plenty of Road Runners, Barracudas. So I've always had a place for Mopar, and I still own a lot of Mopar muscle cars. The thing about Mopar, though, is that they never had the economies that GM had. You could go to any super shop or go online and buy parts for your small block Chevy, where a lot of times you had to order parts for the Mopar 340. The GM engine just became the universal engine performance package for the world. And that continued right up through the LS and now right up through the LT. So there's nothing wrong with the Hemi. It's a great engine. I've heard rumors that the days of the Hemi are numbered as they try to phase it out for more high-tech, smaller engines. And if we look at the JL, I think that the offerings with the 4-cylinder turbo, the hybrid, the V6 Pentastar, the diesel, they're definitely trying to offer other engine performance options other than just the big brute of a Hemi. Now, of course, they do offer the Hemi and the JL, very expensive package, and I think it's more of a marketing gimmick, especially since it was announced at the same time the Bronco came out. Really, if you look at the cost of a JL Hemi and then all the modifications, it kind of prices most people out of the market. So let's go back to the beginning of the JK in about 2008, 2009. If we look at the Hemi and the LS, there's no doubt that the Hemi integrated easier into the JK because it was a Mopar product. I know some of the original guys that actually did it, getting some Hemi tunes out of Chrysler, putting them into the NGC4 computer, and getting them to work in a JK. And while it worked really well, it still was kind of a compromise because you were swapping V8 engine performance parameters into a V6 operating system. So some of the things didn't carry over quite as smoothly as they liked, but as time went on, they pretty much smoothed that out. The real problem in the early days was the transmission. Now, when the W8 580 came out, it really was a big step up. It still wasn't as good as the 6L80. The engines weren't as light, they weren't as compact, they weren't as small, they weren't as well supported. You couldn't tune them as easily. The GM engines just had it all over the Chrysler engines. The issue with the GM engine was how do we get it into a Jeep Wrangler? And that's kind of the task that I took on. When I got my personal JK, it was very disappointing. It was an 09 Rubicon, loved the vehicle, hated the powertrain. And I think we can all universally agree that the 3.8 4-speed was not the best powertrain for a heavy off-road SUV. Now remember that Chrysler saw the Wrangler as an off-road vehicle. So way back to the days of the CJ, YJ, TJ, they put these small engines in, and really all it was meant to do was get you to the trail, and once you got to the trail, the engine was fine. Problem is, when the JK came out and it was a 4-door, it was really heavy, had to meet all the federal standards, crash standards, etc., and people wanted to use it as an SUV. So they wanted to load it up with their family. You got 4 doors, you got storage in the back, so you load these things down, which is exactly what I did in my first trip to New York from Las Vegas, and it's complete disappointment. You start going up some of the grades, you try merging into traffic, and there's just no power. So there's really 2 ways you can get more power. One is to replace the engine with, let's say, a Hemi or an LS, and the other is to install a power adder. And a power adder can be anything from an air intake, a throttle body spacer, a supercharger, a turbocharger, and they're all used in the JK. I'm going to leave the power adders out of this conversation because you all know that you're not going to pick up 200 horsepower with a throttle body spacer. You're not going to pick up 200 foot-pounds of torque with an air intake. Now, some of the superchargers can build horsepower, but then they introduce problems of their own. Drivability, longevity, reliability, turbochargers with their heat. So to some degree, they're all successful, and the benefit of the power adder is it costs less than a V8 swap. But we're going to contain this conversation to the engine swap because really it is the best option if you want the best results, meaning the best drivability, the best sound, the best reliability. Now, I've had the opportunity to drive pretty much every JK powertrain configuration out there, superchargers, turbochargers, driven a lot of the Hemis with the different transmissions, and of course pretty much all of the GM powertrains. So what we were faced with way back then was, what direction do we go? The LS was going to be much more difficult to integrate into the Chrysler operating system. As a brief side note, I did have a guy come to me and he says, hey, I've got a way of letting you run your LS3 engine inside of a Chrysler operating system. All we have to do is add a couple of components to the LS3, make it think it's a Hemi, put the throttle body on and the trigger wheels and things, and then you can run your small aluminum lightweight LS3 in front of the W8 580. And I said, well, there's a lot of problems with this. One, it's not emissions legal. There's never been a US EPA production vehicle with that combination. 2, we're now still slaved to the Chrysler operating system, which means tuning and all that is out the window. And the shops that have gone that direction have found out over the long term that they can't take advantage of what GM has to offer. Like when GM went from the LS to the LT, you're not going to be running a direct injected LT off of a Chrysler computer like you can a Hemi, because you can't mimic that Hemi like you could with the old LS3, which is very simple. If you look at these modern GM computers, they're giant. They've got high voltage drivers in them. They're very sophisticated, and we're going to take a look at that in one of the LT5 builds that we're doing. So I rejected running the LS3 in a Chrysler operating system. Would it have been easier to get full functionality? Yeah, of course it would have. But we're compromising. We're not running the superior GM transmission. We're not running the GM operating systems, which are easy to tune and fully supported in the aftermarket. And you just don't have available to you what you would have if you had, let's say, a Silverado or a Camaro and you wanted to mod it. I wanted to have all that available to you in your JK. So what it then became was installing the GM powertrain in the JK, which is easy. And we use hydraulic mounts on some, and we use polyurethane mounts on others, but it was pretty easy. The hard part was to make all the JK stuff work, cruise control, tap shift, all that. Now, I will say in the early days, it was pretty tough getting this to work, and it was pretty tough for the Hemi guys too. I don't think it was easy. You know, the Hemi guys, they had to do more body modifications. They had to move the steering shaft and hammer on the firewall in some of them, some funny tuning with transmissions. We ran into less of that. We didn't really have any interferences. The LS engine was small enough to where there were no mods required. In fact, in our current conversion, there is no bashing, hammering, cutting, or welding. And as time went on, of course, their swap matured, and so did ours. And we eventually went to the CAN module, which essentially is just a universal bridge. It's a bidirectional bridge that allows the functionality on the JK side, but we stay true to the GM powertrain. So that means whatever GM comes out with, they come out with a L86, an L87, an LT1, the new L8T, an LT4, an LT5. All we have to do is install it in the vehicle, install our bridge, which is the interpreter, and we can run it exactly the way GM intends it. GM can service it exactly the way they intend to. The wiring harnesses, the operating systems, the calibrations, the tunes, and this lends itself to emissions. Remember, if you have a hybrid LS3 with the W580, there is no precedent for that. There is no US EPA or federal government standard for that combination, where we can say, hey, look, we have a factory L94 with a factory 6L80 with factory operating systems, calibrations, and the CVNs are a story we'll talk about later because that's becoming important around the country. And I want to say that's probably true with the Hemi also. They've integrated the Hemi very well into the JK. There's still some more hardware modifications. They still weigh more. They don't cool as well. Really the downside to the Hemi is it's just not as suitable as a powertrain for the JK as the GM engines are. So there's downsides and upsides to both. I haven't been on the forums for a long time, and I really don't watch social media. I know many companies live and die by social media today. I just try to do what I want to do, and what that means is, remember, Motec was my retirement business. If I want to put this engine in this chassis, I'm going to do it because I think it's going to work. I don't want to take that compromise. These LTs are just phenomenal powertrains, and in my opinion, second to none. Now, if you ask 100 people, what would you rather have, an LT1 or a Hemi? Most of the people are going to say, I want an LT1. Just look at the specs. It's 11.5 to 1 compression. It has direct injection. It has a 10-speed transmission. However, if you modify that and say, would you rather have an LT1 or a Hemi in your JK, here's what I find. Most people would rather have the LT1. But if you are a small shop or you're a guy that wants to install an engine, you're probably going to be more intimidated doing the LT swap, and for good reason, because it's a cross-manufacturer swap. Now, Jeep themselves did cross-manufacturer swaps, let's not forget that, but it was done at an OE level. So I think the majority would shift back over to the Hemi or maybe be close to even, because a lot of us think, oh, I've got a Mopar vehicle, I've got to put it in a Mopar engine. Now, if you look at the 3.6 compared to the Hemi or the LSLT, it's a pretty pathetic engine, it's high technology, and for what it is, it does a pretty good job. I don't think it's a very good engine in the JK. I think it makes a pretty good engine in the JL with the 8-speed, but let's be realistic. If you've got a 7,000-pound JK and you're towing a trailer in Colorado, the 3.6 is not going to be the ideal powertrain. So let's fast forward to today. The Wrangler JK is now over a decade old, and the Hemi guys have refined their swap, and we have refined our swap. And the guys doing the hybrids are kind of stuck in between, because as the Hemi powertrain evolves, you can install that in your JK. I think the biggest benefit to the Hemi over the last decade has been the transmission. The Hemi's always been a pretty powerful engine, but the transmissions have always sucked. So if you get the new 8-speed, it's definitely a big step up from the 5-speeds. The LSs, on the other hand, have really evolved. They're not just evolutionary, they're revolutionary, introducing new technologies. Not only the 8-speed and the 10-speed transmissions, but these high compression engines that have continuous variable valve timing. The active fuel management is something that probably most of you don't care about, but the new dynamic fuel management can definitely get you a little bit better economy, and GM is really extending their powertrain dominance from the days of the muscle car. What it comes down to is you can be a Mopar guy, you can be a GM guy. I am both. One of my favorite cars to drive is my 70 Challenger TA, and it looks like Chrysler's actually reintroducing a version of it, but that was a 346 pack. It had 3 Holley carburetors with a tri-power, they used to call it. I love driving that car. So I knew this video was going to be more about rambling, but I think there's a lot of you out there that are trying to decide what direction to go in, and you want to get the best bang for your buck. The GM powertrains traditionally have been less costly than other powertrains just because GM cranks them out in such quantity. Back in 2009, I had to make a choice. I had a 2009 Rubicon that I loved. I knew I was going to have some kids and I couldn't drive my 2-door Toyota anymore. my choice was to do an engine swap. And Autotech, the parent company to Motec, was working with AEV, and we had the option of going with a Hemi. But let's just say some conversations with some of the big guys, we all agreed that the LS powertrain was superior in a JK, but it was going to require a different approach to get it functional in the JK, and that's the route that I chose to go. What I did in 2009 is I went for the LS powertrain. My 09 Rubicon now has just under 100,000 miles on it, and the initial test mule, which is a 2008 JKU, has well over 200,000 miles on it with a 5.3. So what I would do is I would sit down and I'd look at your need. You've got a JK with 37s. You live in Oregon. You know you're going to be going up some steep passes. You know you're going to be driving in some hot weather. And then say, how much money do I have? What is my budget? If you can't afford to go out and buy an $80,000 Hemi JL and then throw another $20,000, $30,000 into it, you're probably going to end up with a JK, which is a great vehicle. You know, the chassis on the JK is very solid. The axles, the D44, I don't think they get enough credit. They hold up pretty good. The JK is a good solid platform. What you need is a better powertrain. So if you're going to keep your vehicle for a year and sell it, look at some of the power adders. Look at the superchargers, turbochargers. You spend $5,000, $6,000, you get an extra 100 horsepower, and it might make you happy. Superchargers and turbochargers, in my opinion, are more for the guy that thinks of the throttle pedal or the skinny pedal as a switch. Don't expect the same drivability, the torque, the sound of a V8. You're just not going to get it. You're not going to get the longevity. You might go through 2 supercharged engines in the lifespan of one LS engine. I've seen LS 6.0s exceed 300,000 miles. But if a power adder works for you, it might be as simple as a cold air intake and a flash tune, which I find, you know, does a little bit, but doesn't do a whole lot. If you got a stock JK and you're looking, I did that with mine when it was stock, trying to hold 75, 80 miles an hour in those zones, and all it really did was gave me some spark knock. But with some hot rodder mods, you might be able to get enough power out of your JK to make you happy. As far as the V8 conversion goes, sit back and look at what your need is. If you don't need a 6.2 or a 6.4, don't get it. You might be happy with a 5.7 Hemi or a 5.3 LT. The 5.3 LT is very underrated in my opinion. It's a fantastic engine. You put an 8 or a 10 speed behind it, and it's going to do what most JKs need to do. At the same time, I think I'm going to say that the 5.7 VVT Hemi is my favorite. 6.4 is a fantastic engine, but it builds power where I don't really need it. These LTs having the bottom end torque like a diesel, especially with the 8 and the 10 speed transmissions, really just makes the driving experience different. When you get off-road, you're not going to be in four-wheel drive low very much. So I hope that helps some of you guys decide. It's pretty confusing out there, especially if you're just getting into this V8 conversion thing. So we're going to hit the mountain with this LT 5.3 8-speed JK, and we'll be back soon.